So now we're going to spend a few minutes talking about not so much a poem as a set of instructions for how you make art by Tristan Tzara, who doesn't really fit in the course because he's not an American poet. He's a famous Dadaist. He's Romanian and French, a poet and essayist and performance artist. But he has such influence on this movement that we've been talking about. He's sort of parallel to the Baroness, although much more thoughtful, can I say, and essayistic about Dadaism. And I don't think she was specifically influenced by him. But we're looking at how to make a Dadaist poem, and it's an instruction. It's famous, done in 1920. I think we should talk a little bit about it as another instance in which modernism can be pushed further, maybe even than what we've talked about. So, somebody want to say what we're supposed to do with this? Allie, what are we supposed to do exactly here?
Well, take a newspaper, cut it up.
Cut what?
Cut up the words.
Take one article.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one article, cut up the words in it, put it in a hat.
Put all the words into a hat, into a bag.
Okay, a bag, excuse me. Then kind of blindly or randomly or accidentally take them out, and that will be your poem.
So take one word out, copy down the poem, and then what claim does he make that's audacious, Amaris, about what the result will be?
So at the end, you will be a writer who is infinitely original, which seems ironic since the process is arbitrary and the source is this.
So what possible sense of originality is this?
I think it's the originality of interpretation. So it's telling us not to be afraid of the nonsense that will inevitably be the product of this exercise, but the poem will be like us in the way that we choose to read it.
Anybody want to try originality in this sense? Anna?
Well, if you're taking something like a newspaper article, let's say it's a front page story about like a fire, let's say, and you take that.
A local newspaper,
Sure.
Apparently, if it's got fire on the front page.
All right.
That's good.
So you take this front page story that's supposed to be objective, just giving you the facts. This is where it was, this is how it started, this is how many people were injured, this is how much damage was done.
Just the facts, ma'am.
Just the facts.
And it's, what kind of writing would you say?
Objective? Or
Pseudo-objective,
reporting,
journalistic, full sentences.
You take all that.
Memorable?
Not really.
In fact, not even, deliberately not memorable. You read an article about a fire on the front page of a newspaper once.
You say that's
and you throw it out.
Recycle it, hopefully. But
well, so, he's recycling it. I'm sure in 1920 you didn't recycle
probably
it.
Not.
Right.
But so here you are. You have this, this language as we've just described it. You put it in a bag, you shake it up, and you completely repurpose it. What does that create? That creates something original.
Does it resemble journalistic prose anymore?
I would hope not.
Probably not. But though the words are the same. Kristen, what does it mean to say, here you are a writer, infinitely original, endowed with a sensibility that is charming, though beyond the understanding of the vulgar?
Well, I think by understanding of the vulgar, he means that the newspaper article itself would have been within the understanding of the vulgar. It would have been something that the common person reads and digests and gets a meaning out of. But this completely unordered poem that's very arbitrary, not even the content matters. He says, pick an article that's the length that you want it to be, not that's about anything that you want your poem to be, is something that the common person would say, what is this, to?
What about vulgar? Anybody want to deal with the word vulgar?
It's loaded.
It's a loaded word, but what does it mean, typically?
Tasteless, classless, sort of connotations
Coarse.
of low morality, yeah.
Low
Prejudice
class,
in
low
the
morality.
sense of journalism always has an angle. So to me, I read that politically as meaning that it's information communicated to the masses. That's what the purpose of a newspaper is. And he's subverting all that by cutting it up.
Isn't he reversing vulgar then? It would be the urinal upside down that would be called vulgar by its critics. It would be the nude descending a staircase that would be called vulgar. Right? It would be this nonsense, this Dada cut-up that would be vulgar. He's turning it around, isn't he?
So the people who don't understand this are the ones that are vulgar.
Well, he might be making that judgment, I hope somewhat ironically or facetiously, but he's certainly saying something about the newspaper article about the fire. So I think we've sort of established that he's reversing the charge, and that what's vulgar is the language that you write in plain sentences and throw away. What about the claim just prior to that? The poem will be like you. Dave?
I think he's making a comment on randomness being choice, because before that he makes it clear, take out each scrap one by one, copy them conscientiously. That is...
I love conscientiously there.
People would look at that and say it's a completely random process, but each time it's a choice. And I think he's saying something about how randomness can be a choice and it can be unique.
Okay, good. That's a good start. Somebody else? Why, Molly, why would the poem be like you? It seems like since it's so random, it wouldn't be at all a self-expression.
Right, but you're the one doing the work. I think in this case it's more about the process of making the poem.
Self-expression, here's how I'm feeling. The traditional I of post-romantic or romantic and post-romantic expression, this is how I'm feeling, actually, says Tzara and his colleagues, turns out to be rote, socialized, routinized, and already determined meaning. Just at the point where you think, this is my original feeling. What's really original is something that doesn't come from that traditional place of self-expression. Does that make sense? That's probably as important a lesson as you could possibly learn about the constraint-based or form-based writing, that it takes subjectivity away, but actually subjectivity is already so encrusted with received meaning about how the self feels that to abandon subjectivity, ironically or paradoxically, brings you to yourself. Anybody want to say one more thing about this? The poem will be like you. It's so audacious.
Just getting back to randomness, it just makes me think of, the depending on how long the article is, how long you want your poem to be, there are so many ways for it to potentially turn out. And that kind of just goes back to, the origin of every person. The chance that that you, the writer, would be you and be the writer. I don't know.
What about infinitely original? What about the word infinitely? I mean, following from Allie's comment about, there's certainly in an article about a fire, 200-word article, you've got a lot of possible combinations and permutations. Each one of them will be distinct. You can do a whole lot more than you thought with these kinds of sentences. Any thoughts about this? Infinitely original?
I think the infinite speaks to a sort of immortality as well, because the newspaper is something that you discard every day, and he seems to be highlighting the necessity of destruction before newness of creation. And here he's cutting it down to every word, but I think as we move more towards contemporary poetry, that'll be cut down even further to the level of the syllable, even the letter. And so in that way, you can infinitely cut down and infinitely recreate.
This seems to be, I don't want to use the word extreme lightly, but an extremity of the claim of make it new. For instance, William Carlos Williams in Spring and All, in the prose of Spring and All, said that what we wanted to do was the poetic equivalent of destroying the Carpathian Mountains, of taking a natural rise and completely flattening it, starting over. That's revolutionary talk, violent talk. And as much as we admire Williams, he didn't actually destroy in that kind of way. Nobody actually destroyed. Although there is some destruction here, literally a newspaper is being destroyed. And one last consideration on this. He's having us deconstruct a newspaper. And though your example of the fire is fairly neutral, what if it's an article about the armistice? Or what if it's an article about prohibition? Or what if it's an article about the suppression of left-wing parties in Central Europe right after World War I? Is this, even though it doesn't seem to be political, in what way is this a political intervention?
I think Dada was pretty inherently political, because a lot of the Dadaists felt that it's really difficult, because Dada really rises during and after World War One, and a lot of them felt like you can't really have art that is aesthetic in a world that has been so torn apart by the destruction that they saw in World War One.
How could we write whole after all this fragmentation? But let's talk about this piece itself. Can anybody say how this instruction could be political?
Well, the nonsense that would emerge would not be held down by an ideological position the way that a newspaper is. We can often label newspapers as conservative
It's
or liberal.
freed of ideology.
Right. That's what I want to say.
Well,
Political intervention?
The words in it, even though
No.
an
I,
example of them.
I agree with what I definitely think that's a possibility. But at the same time, there's also the possibility that depending on the placement of the words and just chance in
I meant
general.
in the Steinian sense.
Okay,
That's
yeah.
what I meant.
But I also think it's interesting that, like, depending on chance in general, something completely contrary to what the original author intended might result, which is also that's political in itself.
Couldn't he also be just questioning the way we get our news?
Of course. He's destroying the medium. He's questioning the medium. We're about to move to chapter 3, where we'll meet very briefly two communist poets of the Depression in the United States, two political poets. And you will find them reverting to narrative and descriptive language. In a way, Tzara and others are saying, no, there's a lot of ways to be political, and the most fundamental way to be political, they would say, this is a claim that we can accept or reject, the most fundamental way is to say to those who are making sense, particularly after World War I, which is not a war that made a ton of sense, the language you speak, this coherent language you speak, makes no sense to me. I do not understand. What you've done is nonsense, and I am going to respond by speaking nonsense. I'm going to respond by speaking in a way that makes no sense to you. I'm not willing to mean on the same level that you mean. Instead of responding with a position against a position, the idea is to take no position at all and to recycle the words that were used as a way of feeding back what nonsense it was in the first place. That's a kind of formally radical way of being political. And this man, Tzara, eventually in the 30s became an anti-fascist, got involved in the Spanish Civil War against Franco, and in a way you could see some of these moves with political writing, such as journalistic writing, toward his anti-fascist positions by being so anti-authoritarian in the way he makes meaning. Final word on this, who's ever done anything like this? You have it. What's fun about doing this?
I think it's really fun to not know what's going to happen. And then to just there's something very liberating about not having, it's funny that he says copy conscientiously, because what's liberating for me is not having conscious, really will of, not having choice as to how it turns out.
And I believe that the person who taught you to do this is in chapter 9 of our course. Is that Charles Bernstein?
That's Charles.
And it turns out that William Burroughs, on the most avant-garde side of the Beat movement, picked this up again and did cut-ups in 1959 and 1960. And then this becomes a mode that in part gets adopted by Jackson McClough and John Cage, and then the language poets such as Charles Bernstein. So this actually becomes, although it's an extreme end of modernism as we've studied so far, it's going to come back again and again as an important way to suppress the tendency to be subjective, traditionally subjective, to suppress the creative ego, and to release the infinitely original.